Would you like to kick us off with the first session?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. So we have our first speaker for today, Amy Matthews. I see you're here, Amy. So I really like Amy uses this powerful metaphor of snakes and ladders to explore how higher education can better support students impacted by poverty. So we'll aim for a 20-minute talk, although we do have a little more time, so that's flexible, I guess, followed by Q&A. So just a couple of things as well. So as Paolo said, the session is automatically recorded, so feel free to turn off your camera if you prefer, and feel free to use the chat throughout the session for comments or questions, and I'll keep an eye on time and the chat. So over to you, Amy. You should be able to share your screen.
Good morning. Right, hopefully it's ready. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's always the same, isn't it? When you're kind of being watched, it's not there, whereas I had it open. Let's try again. There it is. There we go. Can everyone see that okay? Brilliant. Okay, so first of all, kind of disclaimer at the beginning, I'm afraid that it's not some sort of snazzy game, some sort of immersive game, although that would have been lovely. I wasn't able to kind of put the time into that. So I am really just relying on an analogy today, snakes and ladders, to think about a particular demographic of student. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this, because it's something which I'm really passionate about. So basically, the kind of demographic of student that I want to consider today are students. I think when we're looking at data, for access and participation plans, we'd be talking about like a low polar 4 quintile student, and we'd be thinking about an index of multiple deprivation. So the reason I'm thinking about this is that I live on an estate which is mainly social housing in a coastal area, and as a primary school teacher and a special needs coordinator before I came into higher education, I've had a lot of experience working with this type of demographic, so I have a real keen interest in this. These students that I'm going to talk about today typically are cognitively diverse. Now, in higher education, I think we're really good at talking about inclusion and diversity, but I do wonder sometimes if this particular demographic gets missed. So it'll be interesting today to kind of give them a bit of a focus. Also, when we're talking about widening participation in universities, we often focus on recruitment, but forget to think about retention and progression, and making sure that these students, when they join us, have a really good experience and stay with us and have good outcomes. So perhaps controversially, what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that some of these students we get to sign up may not actually have the capacity for learning, but I want to talk about the ladders we can put in place to overcome that difficulty. So if we start off by thinking about the players of this game, and I am going to hopefully push some buttons first thing this morning and talk a bit controversially, but in the literature, this is really evident of the type of students I'm talking about. But I think perhaps more interestingly, it's what I hear in the office, it's what I hear when I talk to colleagues, that some of these students, they might be really frustrating to academics. They're the ones who might appear with quite significant learning needs, where we feel that actually maybe some of those learning needs are insurmountable when it comes to higher education. There might also be the students who exhibit kind of what we think are low aspirations. They might be the ones that don't turn up to lectures, and they might be the ones that don't seem to engage in the right way. And I have heard, oh, excuse me. Sorry. I have heard, and I've been part of conversations that talk about whether these students should even be at university. Do they, should they be in higher education? So I think if we are going to sign up to the sustainable goals and think about that commitment that we've made in higher education, that all students should be able to access education, and that we get rid of that bias and prejudice in education, that this demographic, this really quite challenging demographic that I'm talking about today, we need to make sure that we're including them and doing what we can to give them a good experience at university. I think it's really helpful to think about poverty as sort of multi-dimensional and multi-layered. We're moving away from that narrow focus of poverty being just about income and thinking really about that holistic view. So I suppose in research, we'd be thinking about a more ethnographic kind of perspective. And this is really helpful, I think, because we can have a more empathic view of students thinking about their lived experience. And I think that gives us a more authentic view of what we can do to support these students when they're at university. On another day, I would love to waffle about a paradigm shift that I think needs to happen in higher education. So I'm touching on that today. But I think what we do need to recognise is what we're not saying here is that we should be sort of patronising or pitying of people living in poverty. We need to be aware of that attitude and actually sort of remove ourselves from that and think more objectively about the risk factors and the real vulnerabilities that a lot of these students face when they're coming into university. So often they're the first students from their families to come into university as well. So that comes with its own challenges, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So I think all students have their own challenges. They've got their own narrative and stories to think about. But when we look at the literature and we look at this demographic I'm talking about today, there are some sort of underlying threads or common themes that we can kind of pull out of the research. And the strongest one for me is that of stress. So not only do these students enter the university system being more stressed than maybe the sort of traditional learner, but also they've grown up with that stress. So what we know from the research is that families who are impacted by poverty, the stress that surrounds them, actually, this can have an impact on the development of children. So as a special needs coordinator, I saw this in the work that I used to do, and that we actually see biological changes, atypical development happening with children who are existing in stressful environments. So that can manifest itself in learning needs. It can manifest itself in inability to self-regulate. So behaviour challenges, a difficulty in paying attention. It might even look like things like dyslexia, and there is underachievement at school. And so what we see when we come to the university is that students from these backgrounds often will have, they'll be accepted with lower UCAS points because of the fair access scheme, that the sort of tariff points that they need to meet are lower. And so academics are aware of that deficit in attainment when students arrive. And again, with that can come that sort of labelling or stigmatism as well as soon as they enter the system. So I think these players are quite courageous. They've made it, you know, they've filled in all those forms, they've overcome student finance questions and all the rest of it, and they're about to enter the game of higher education. They unwrap this board game only to find that there is no instruction manual. So the institution of university comes with its own culture, traditions and expectations, which have not really been made explicit. And I kind of see this a bit like the first time you go to a yoga class. So you sort of walk in, it's really high risk, you feel really exposed. You're just going to copy what everyone else does. You're not quite sure what you're doing and you're thinking, how on earth am I going to get into that position? I think it's quite similar for students when they're entering university, especially if nobody in their family has been before. And even when academics do try and explain the rules, maybe they kind of look at assessment criteria with them. The way that that information is received is going to be coloured by the experiences that those students have had previously as well, which sets up its own challenges. So the game of higher education is meant to be designed, I think, for social mobility. I think that's the most powerful aspect of higher education. So as we're setting up this game, we should feel that there's a fair chance that our players will win or be as successful as their counterparts. But as they engage with the game, we begin to see that there are a lot of snakes on the board. So it's sort of understood that when students enter university for the first time, there are some key things which will make them successful in their first year, and that is autonomy, self-efficacy, and the ability to integrate socially. So those three things are going to create that resilience for students to stay at university. And we can understand that actually, if a student is encountering unfamiliar academic culture, and they have that little bit of imposter syndrome, and they don't have that self-efficacy, which we know is important, actually, you know, this can create real problems and set them back straight away. And there's also the hidden curriculum. So there's all the sort of stuff that maybe we don't make as explicit as possible. So we might expect students to be digitally fluent. We might think that they can easily go to the library and take a book out and know how to do that and how to find research that they need for their learning. All of that stuff is sort of hidden. So if those expectations are not explained and just assumed, and then on top of that, they've come from a background where they've been led to believe that they probably shouldn't be at higher education anyway, then this is really problematic. I think what's really interesting as well is that perhaps we don't talk about this as much with academics because we're used to this, but learning actually feels uncomfortable. The actual feeling of encountering new knowledge and doing things which are difficult, where we create that change in the long-term memory, which is what learning is meant to be, actually it feels really uncomfortable. And I do a lot of work with students actually talking about how they're feeling when they encounter work. I think it's important that when they're encountering that uncomfortable feeling in the classroom, that we point that out and we make them aware that that is actually an important part of the progress they need to be making. Now, if they're under stress anyway, and they've got all of these other things that they're worrying about, this can be like an insurmountable thing. They suddenly encounter this stuff that's really difficult, and that could be enough to really set them back. And then next to derail our students are the snakes of disengagement. And there's a national conversation at the moment, isn't there, about attendance, poor attendance in higher education. And I think, you know, this is probably one of the first things that starts to happen. So if there is an inability to understand what's happening in class, a bit of imposter syndrome going on, and high stress levels, then, you know, attendance is going to suffer. So according to what I've read, engagement can be understood as the skill that's needed to complete a task combined with the desire to do so. So actually the desire might be there, but if there is a skill deficit, then suddenly that engagement will begin to kind of fall away. So in summary, when we're looking at all these snakes, those dispositional, those internal factors we've talked about, and external factors, you know, such as even like commuting distance, petrol costs, childcare costs, all of that stuff will impact on the amount of information that a student is trying to process. So we call that cognitive load, the amount of information that's being processed at a time. On top of that, we know that as well as neurodevelopmental difficulties like ADHD or dyslexia causing poor executive functioning, that also things like a lack of sleep and anxiety and stress will lead to that poor executive functioning. So what I mean by that is being able to pay attention, your working memory, self-regulating when you're learning, all of that will be impacted on these kind of stress factors that we're talking about. And actually, in order to read in the way that we do in higher education and compose pieces of writing, that really requires high executive functioning skills to be able to do that. On top of that, we know from the literature that this demographic often will have poorer language skills. They've been exposed to less language. They might not have the experience of communicating and articulating ideas. So that is, again, like a real barrier when it comes to accessing what they're doing in the classroom. And the self-regulation bit's interesting, isn't it? I often feel like the students I come into contact who are finding this difficult are the ones who just really need the right answer now, or they might be a little bit critical or a little bit defensive. And that's all to do with the fact they're trying to process all this information and they're not able to regulate their own sort of study skills and feelings. So this sounds quite negative, but the good news is that we really can build ladders to overcome those snakes. We need to remember that recruiting students from widening participation backgrounds is not sufficient. It's about what we do when they get to university. I think that the last sort of 10 years or so of educational research has been really exciting. It's mainly been focused on schools, but we know that evidence-based practice is proving that there are things we can do within the learning environment that can have a real impact, a positive impact on students who have got these lower starting points. So let's start with an old but sturdy ladder that most of us will be familiar with in higher education institutions, and that is the specialist academic. We don't want to get rid of this ladder. It's really, really important. But being an expert in a field is not the same as being a good or effective teacher. And whilst a secure understanding of content is really important, it only has minimal impact when we look at the research. So before we can share that content with students, we need to be using our assessment. We need to be using robust formative assessment in the classroom to work out exactly where the student is, what information they need, and how they need that delivered. But before tutors can be ready to do that, we need to look really carefully at the curriculum and the building blocks of the content that they're hoping to deliver. It's a little bit like being a driving instructor when we're reverse parking. We need to think about the positioning of the car, how we're going to turn the wheel, which mirrors to look in, what's happening in terms of the context outside. There's all these little adjustments need to be made and we need to consider when we're learning something for the first time. The thing is that knowledge domains that we're encountering at university have often been they've been developed over a really long time. They draw on a lot of different cultures, use theories and debates and discourses that may have been developed over centuries. So specialist academics who have been immersed in that for their whole education may find it difficult to untangle all the different pieces that it requires in order for that student to access that content. But this is really important. So it's by doing this that we can create that robust framework for effective formative assessment to happen. So this is really the starting point. And as part of that process, when we're kind of picking apart the content to work out what all the different pieces are, we need to think about the language that's being used. So explicit teaching of key vocabulary is really fundamental for these students that we're talking about. This might look like pre-teaching vocabulary, so exposing them to keywords before they come across the content. It might look like repetition of words and phrases, so they become familiar with them. It might also look like giving them tasks so they can apply and practice those words and phrases within that module. I think what's also really important here to consider is that sort of multimodal, like semiotic, wide language aspect as well. So this might look like images that are relevant to that module. It might look like cultural tools or data collection methods. There's lots of things that we do within higher education that make meaning or include like an understanding of meaning behind them. And that needs to be taught explicitly so that these students can access the content that we're delivering. And then there's mindfulness. So this goes back to what I was talking about with executive functioning. We need to think about how we can facilitate mindfulness of learning. And in this case, I mean mindfulness as in paying attention to the content that's being delivered. So as part of that, I think primary school teachers are really good at this. It could just be as simple as minimizing disruption in the classroom and making sure that everybody is focused. But it could also be about making sure that we're being really clear in like how we're explaining things. So as you're listening to me now, you might find I'm talking a bit quickly, or you've got a cat in the background, or there's like a car outside, and we're processing all of this information. As a teacher, I need to think about what is the extraneous load? What's the bit of that information you're processing that actually is distracting from what it is that you need to be learning, and how can we minimize that so that we can really focus? One of the things that I've done with my team and we've looked at is embedding predictability or routine and learning patterns within the learning environment. So we might have a 4-hour session, but how is that divided up so that it's familiar to students and they know what to expect? So there are things like that we can do in the classroom, like a timetable or kind of visual motifs and things we can use to guide students through the day that reduces that cognitive load and means that they can be really mindful of the learning that's in place at that time. So this is a really quick example today, but hopefully what I've managed to kind of pull together for you is an example of how evidence-based practice in education has a place at university. I think it's exciting because it's not long, and I've seen this before students begin to construct their own ladders. So if we start by doing things like that responsive teaching, it increases self-confidence and we see that resilience being built. If we use that explicit language teaching, that can lead to more autonomous academic reading as that confidence is built. So I think that, I know that when we start to build these ladders, we can overcome those snakes that these students encounter. And I think that's how we can move towards a fairer and more equitable higher education.
Great. Many thanks, Amy. Many thanks for the insightful session. Are there any questions for Amy? There are some comments in the chat saying that was a really great session. Actually, I do have a question for you, although I'm a statistician, so I'm a bit biased. So I was just wondering whether you run any surveys or you collect any data on student experiences in Coventry to inform your approach, especially around poverty and inclusion. I mean, not necessarily you, or whether there's any team working on it.
It's interesting, actually. I think I have a slight motive for doing this, because I know that the academic director that I'm working with quite closely at the moment, he's part of a working party that is looking at this. I've also sit on the Inclusion Diversity Committee and was really excited to see the Access and Participation Plan with really aspirational targets. And I think it's that's kind of made me quite excited about trying to get involved. So I thought if I did a little bit of research in my own time, I might be able to get onto that working party. So that's where my motive is. So we'll see where we go with that.
Great.
I'm not sure if I can put my hand up somewhere, but I had a question. Yeah, so I think I'm finding a lot of the time the students don't know what they need to do in the week, so they'll have a list of readings perhaps to do, but they don't really think it's for them, and they don't know why they need to do it. Yeah, so yeah, well, I mean, how do we get around that? Do you
Oh,
think?
it's really all this stuff pops into my head when you say that, because I get really excited about this. But I think the research around metacognition in schools is really helpful, and I use this a lot when I'm teaching. So I'll read with the students. It might be just breaking down a journal article and saying, being honest and saying, actually, I don't read all of it. So I'll read this bit and then I'll read this bit, and then I'll sort of decide whether to go back into the data section afterwards. Or it might be that actually it's about the skill of pulling together different ideas from different pieces of reading to formulate a paragraph. So some of the work I've done with students recently is this is how you write a paragraph, and this is how I'm embedding. And the other thing that comes out of that reading, I often hear academics talking about, you need to analyze more, you need to use more critical thinking, but actually, what does that really look like? So I think, modeling that and actually dissecting it so that it's really explicit within the classroom environment, suddenly reading becomes purposeful then. And it's oh, right, okay, now I know why I've got to read that, I think.
Great.
I'm wondering, how do you share those practices with colleagues? I guess because there's a lot of academics out there who are doing great stuff, but they don't really know. Yeah, but there's kind of a formula of lecturing that people are just repeating that doesn't necessarily including reading with students, breaking down articles, and all those great things that other academics are doing.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I'm very much a believer that it's building relationships. I'm really privileged that I get to do teaching observations with my colleagues. And what I find is that everyone is very different. There isn't one way to teach that is a good way of teaching. So what I like to do is kind of be curious about that person, that lecturer, and actually kind of draw out things which I think lend themselves to their style of teaching. So we're building on people's expertise. We're not kind of being critical and saying, this is how you do it. And it takes time, doesn't it, ultimately, I think. Hi, Wendy, I can see you've got your hand up.
Hi, thanks, Amy. Really interesting session. I just have a quick question for you. So I was also trained as an evidence-based teaching practitioner, and so a lot of what you said chimes with my professional practice. But I just wondered how we avoid slipping into problematic deficit language when we're talking about students lacking skills or lacking the ability to. And I mean, I prefer to take a more social model like we would to disability, where we're also focusing on how it's the structures and institutions that are a deficit, and also thinking about how the strengths that of resilience and overcoming challenges that some of our WP students bring with them. So I just wondered if you could speak to that.
It's massive, isn't it? Thank you for asking me that question, because that, if I had a choice to do some research, that's where I would go with it. I've been really interested at the moment with the HTQs that we're looking at, which seem to be work-placed higher education courses. And what I like about that idea is that we're starting with where we want to end up. We're not starting with a history of theory and culture that we haven't had the privilege to be part of. I'm really aware that however much I read, that there'll be like some kind of Roman like theory or something that I've never encountered because I didn't go to private school, that kind of thing. So actually, if we're looking at HTQs, which is a course which is built at that level, the academic sort of expertise is the same, but actually the background is something which is more accessible. Does that make sense? So I think in some ways that's where we need to go with higher education. We need to be writing courses which are absolutely relevant for today's students. And I think the other thing is giving opportunities for students to share their own cultural interests. So my husband, for example, is a DJ. He's a vinyl DJ and he's amazing. He's got no qualifications, but what he doesn't know about like hip hop music or kind of certain cultures in terms of that kind of rebellious, I guess, like culture stuff, it doesn't get included in higher education as much as I'd like to see. We choose the cultures that we kind of teach. So I think you're right about that deficit model. But what I would also want to say with that is we do need to, I think, acknowledge that there is a sense of deficit. Because if we don't acknowledge the kind of vulnerabilities and the challenges that people on a daily basis really, really face. So I think we've got to be very clear about the two things. And one of those things is about language, isn't it? Let's just teach that language and that be explicit about the stuff that you need to access things, and let's not pretend that that deficit isn't there. So it's huge, Wendy, but thank you for asking that question.
Amy, sorry, there are a couple of comments in the chat. So Julie's asking whether you could share the reference list. I'm sure this is something we can do later, right?
Yeah.
And Beth also is asking a question. So she says, on top of all these challenges, we want students to develop transferable skills, digital literacy, etc. Of course, we can try to embed this in the program, but how can we help them recognize the value of these things and not just look for the grades?
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? And I think there's a trend at the moment to be looking at trying to shortening degree programs. And I'm sure for some people that's right. I think it's about choice in the end. But for me, higher education is about that personal development. And I really worry that if we kind of shorten programs, we're not giving all those opportunities for that personal development. And so, yeah, I think it's about curriculum design, isn't it? It's about embedding these things into the curriculum. And, so one of the assessments I've just designed on a course I've written recently is around podcasting, because I think there's so much value in that kind of long form conversation that it is in culture today. We're really lucky to have access to that. So what better way to assess what a student knows than to actually get them to create a podcast episode?
Yeah, it would be super useful. Yeah, I think Nikki, did you have your head up?
Yes, I was about to start putting it in the chat. Thank you very much for your talk. It's really interesting. You mentioned right at the beginning the importance of formative assessment. I'm just interested whether you have when you recommend any types of formative assessment that wouldn't kind of be anxiety inducing, because obviously there's a lot of anxiety in the type of students that you talk about. So are there any kind of types of formative assessment that you use and work well in a classroom where you've got such a kind of mix of students?
Thank you. Again, it's really hard, isn't it? Because I watched a tutor the other day who I would say is like he's got that mastery of teaching. And on the surface, it almost looks like he's just chatting to students. But what I can see is actually that he's having that dialogue, that meaningful dialogue with individual students. And then he's adjusting what he's doing in the moment to meet the needs of those students. And the truth of it is there is not an easy way to get to a point where we're using formative assessment effectively. And I remember Shirley Clark kind of doing some books, and I think, there was a lot of trends around in schools, lucky lollipop sticks to make sure everybody answered. And, there's kind of things on the board that you can use. But ultimately, I think what formative assessment is for me is knowing your students and really trying to find out what they think, what they believe, and what they understand, and where the misconceptions are. And for me, that comes through conversation. So I tend to find that when I'm doing a talk, I found today's talk really hard because it's really one-sided. I prefer to have a conversation. So if I kind of know my content and I've got really secure knowledge of those building blocks of that content that I want students to access, I don't really need to kind of put any arbitrary measures in for formative assessment, because what I'm actually doing is talking to them. I might have a bit of a journey that I'm going to take them through, but I'm going to let them use questions and conversation and tasks to really unpick where they are with it. So unfortunately, I just don't think there is an easy way to do it, but I think the effort is worth it, you know, to keep talking about it. Thank you for your question, Nikki. I hope that was helpful. I'm not sure if it was, but
Yeah, no, it was. Yeah, there's not an easy answer.
yeah, I think that ethical stuff is really important to think about as well. I think, you know, I wanted to pick on a couple of things today, which I know maybe feel a bit uncomfortable, but that thing about the conversations in the office about students who shouldn't be at university, you know, it's fine to have that conversation, isn't it? You know, I think that until we're really honest about those conversations, then we don't actually make progress. But if we're going to have that widening participation and we've got fair access schemes and everything else, we can't actually deny the fact that these students are with us. So they've already signed up. It's then our kind of our problem really to make sure that they access education. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really enjoying these comments actually.
Did you have any thoughts about large class sizes? Sam asks.
Well, I haven't had a huge amount of exposure to that actually. I think for my own personal development, that would be the next step. I don't think I'd actually change much about what I do, if I'm honest. I think, yes, you've got a bigger audience, but there's got to be an element of reading that audience still and some sort of interaction. But yeah, I have to admit, I just don't have a lot of experience with that yet.
Sam, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, so I am an academic skills advisor. I used to be a lecturer, but I've moved into a different role. And when I was a lecturer, I had quite small cohorts, so really no more than 30, 35 students in a room. And I'm an advocate of the approach that Amy's talking about in terms of, discussion, and I prefer to teach in that way as well. But in my new role, I just recently did a focus group with some students about feedback, assessment feedback, and their take on feedback, etc. And something that really came through was that a lot of them were on courses where there were 100 people in the room, and they really felt like the lecturer didn't know them, they didn't know the lecturer. There wasn't that opportunity for that dialogue and that conversation, and that actually filtered through into their feedback. They felt that their feedback, one of them mentioned about they definitely had feedback that had been copied and pasted. But and a couple of the final year students said, actually, now I'm in my final year and I'm in smaller class sizes, I actually feel like I'm getting feedback that's personalized to me. And I feel like my lecturers know me and I know them. So I think it is a real barrier, because where you do have such big cohorts, you're losing that opportunity, because it is impossible. If you're one lecturer in a room of 100 students, it's not possible to, achieve that sort of environment or that atmosphere.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Sam.
Sandra has also commented on that large class sizes comment where they have arranging tables into islands, although this is also a matter of having the right rooms capacity, etc. Yeah, I'd always wanted to do that, but we don't have any.
There's so much research out
classic...
there, isn't there, about learning environments and what you can do to change how learning happens depending on the environment. It's really powerful.
Exactly.
I'm teaching accounting courses and my students from non-accounting background, a bit difficult to get their attention. That's must be the biggest challenge. I don't know. I mean, there's definitely something about having passion for your subject, isn't there, that has an impact on learning.
Yeah. Barbara?
Hello, thank you very much for that presentation, Amy. That's really interesting. And I do promote formative assessment in my classes. I used to be learning development unit advisor, but now I'm teaching them postgraduate students. And although, assessments are mostly summative assessments, I tend to build in the formative assessments. And this term, I've started to use the rubric and get them to self-reflect, self-assess their work, and then peer assess. And then when they come to the tutorials, I get them to talk about, their self-assessment. And I can see how reflective they become. And the summative final assessments that I've just assessed are really of high quality. And I can see the discussions, the discussion points being incorporated into their work. And so it's the snakes and ladders is another way of scaffolding, isn't it? So I quite like that approach, and the dialogic approach is what I promote as well. And initially, when I started as a learning development tutor 10 years ago, I found that, just checking the students' work didn't improve learning at all. There was no development at all. And I felt that I was an imposter bearing this name. I'm a learning developer. I'm not developing the learners. And then I said, well, let's talk about your work. What have you done? Why did you do it? How did you do it? And the how and the whys are always in my conversation. And sometimes the students think, well, if you go to Barbara, she asks too many questions. and I said, well, I need to know how you got there. Could you just tell me? And so, they've learned to work with me, and I quite enjoy hearing their experiences of, why they got this reading and why did they put this quote in, and where did they find the quote? And normally it comes from Google. And so, it's taking back to the literature search, and all these skills come together as well. So, I mean, I really admire the work that you've done. And in future, if I can join you in some way, because, we were thinking about the same thing, scaffolding in different ways, and dialogic conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
Yeah.
Have you come across Rob Webster did a book
Yes.
for teaching assistants, and I really like his scaffolding framework that he uses, this idea of moving towards independence, so modeling with them and then giving them clues and then gradually moving towards being more independent. I think scaffolding is really at the heart, isn't it, of effective teaching. I agree with you. I think also, to add to what you were saying, I really like that conversation that you're having when you're talking about why and trying to unpick it. I think I've also found, and I bet you do this naturally as well, that it's about talking about how they're feeling about different things. Arthur Cropley is somebody I really like and admire when his work on creativity, and he talked about the different kind of feelings and thought processes we go through when we're doing a creative process. So the one I talk to my students about is that divergent thinking, when they don't actually know what the answers are yet, they're just thinking outside the box, and that can actually feel really confusing and quite frustrating. And if we're not familiar with that feeling, you can feel really anxious. But actually, I enjoy that feeling when I'm researching now, because it's like endless possibilities. Where's this going to go? So I think actually that kind of, like you're talking about, that reflective nature of self-assessment, but also incorporating that kind of emotional intelligence for students is really, really important, especially if they've had these backgrounds that I've mentioned today. But I'd love to link up and have a chat, Barbara. So yeah,
I've got your email address.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And Amy, I don't know if you've seen, there is one more question in the chat. So by offering ladders and sociologically informed facilitations, aren't we in a way promoting fostering higher grades, or the specialism of course specific knowledge?
It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast the other day. I bet it was wonky, because it's not usually anything more than that. Stick wonky on, and they were, maybe it was a different one, but they were talking about the idea of actually not having grades. Maybe it was the Times Ed one. And I thought, what an interesting idea. because we are kind of lacking that intrinsic motivation for learning a lot of the time, aren't we? I think that's what we're talking about. And, you know, there's that kind of tendency to want to come out with a grade or a piece of paper to say that I've got something. I don't know. I think that intrinsic motivation for learning is something that's, for me, I think it's really deep, and I think it takes real time, and I don't think we can actually have one or the other. I think building relationships with students and giving them a positive experience of education is likely to then make them want to come back and do learning in the future and to continue that learning. I mean, I'm somebody that's always got my nose in an article or a book or a podcast. And it's not because I want to kind of prove anything to anybody. I'm just really curious. But I think that's come from the fact that I've had positive educational experiences. So I think we can't sort of take away those structures. I think it's probably both. I think that's what we're talking about. But yeah, metacognition's huge as well. Could do a whole talk on metacognition. I love it.
Great. Are there any other questions for Amy? Barbara, do you have any other questions, or do you still have your hand up from?
Oh, sorry, I need to put that down.
No, it's okay. Just wondering. Something in the chat.
Yeah, I do think this class size thing or lecture theatre size thing is really interesting. It's something that I'm going to go away and sort of consider. I think until I've had that experience, it's difficult to know how that would feel. But I mean, I think also I went to a university where there were lectures and I loved it. And I think, you know, it's sometimes just having choice for students and not thinking that every student is suited to every type of learning. I think that's part of the issue as well. And when I went to Goldsmiths University, I just came across the most amazing lecturers who had just had this incredible expertise. But I was in a place where I could kind of listen and absorb that. And I just don't think that's right for every student, actually. The name of Rob Webster's book is Maximising Impact of Teaching Assistants, and it's based on a sort of meta-analysis of the effectiveness of teaching assistants, and it was found that TAs didn't actually help students, controversially, but there was some really good stuff that came out of that as well.
Thank you.
When we first started really open courses, we kept the class sizes small, but now it's a funding issue rather than a pedagogic one. Yeah. I would imagine it's a learning environment one as well, is it? Because I suppose if you're talking to a lot of people online like we are now, we've got the capacity to use breakout rooms and kind of, you know, have those kind of smaller conversations. Whereas actually, if you're in a lecture theatre that's immovable, then there's greater challenges. But I've got to say, I would be one of those people that would be getting people out of their seats. That's just, I mean, when I was a primary school teacher, one of the first things I did was I got the caretaker to cover up the whiteboard because I didn't want to be a sage on the stage. So I moved the room around and, you know, I'd be on the floor, I'd be at a table. So I've got that rebelliousness. I think I'd kind of see it as a challenge in a lecture theatre rather than a limitation. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this morning and meeting people. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's nice we had some time for discussion as well. Great. So if there are not any other questions, so I will put the session feedback form in the chat, although, I mean, it's the same for, I think it's the same for all our sessions, so you can fill it in later. So thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Amy. And we will see you later and tomorrow and Friday. Thanks, everyone.